am happy to introduce Mr. Bekker from the Toledo Zoo. Kent, we give a background. So Kent got his bachelor's degree at, hopefully I remember all this, I didn't ask him ahead of time, Grand Valley State University. Got his master's at Bowling Green State University. Has been a member of the Toledo Zoo since 1997. Was a general herp keeper there until just this past year, where he is now the Wild Toledo Program Coordinator. And he's going to talk today a little bit, he'll give you a little bit of an intro about the program that he now runs, and then he's going to talk about kind of some long-term studies that he's been involved in with the Blandings turtles in Ohio. So, that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. And we're going to let me orientate myself here quickly. So Wild Toledo is a new project that we just started at the Toledo Zoo, and the main idea behind it is it's an effort to increase our on-grounds biodiversity, but also to do a little bit more local conservation. The Toledo Zoo does quite a bit with Carner blues and things locally, but a lot of our conservation efforts are a little bit further away from the zoo proper itself, which provides some unique opportunities, but also some difficulties. So Wild Toledo is an effort to bring a little bit more of that home, and some of the things we're doing currently, we're installing 4 acres of native meadow on grounds, which is really cool. It gives us an opportunity to talk about urban habitat and things like that and the value of some of these native plantings. We're currently working on a mesopredator project. Mesopredators pose a pathogenic concern to our captive collection, and this way we are both sterilizing them so that they're non-reproductive and also doing health assessments on them. But the coolest part is we're doing some spatial ecology using radio telemetry and GPS units. And that's drawing on some work that I did with Blandings turtles that we'll get into in a few. We're monitoring on grounds both in these newly created habitats, the prairie locations, and also throughout the grounds to get an idea of what species are currently using the zoo grounds, native species of wildlife. And we're using pretty standard techniques for a lot of that. A lot of the techniques that you guys are probably covering this week out here as far as Sherman traps and trail cams, cover objects. We're applying mark recapture and things like that to see what's using our grounds and what we can do to improve that habitat for those animals. A lot of people come to the zoo and think of it for the exotic species that reside in the enclosures, but there's a lot that uses the zoo grounds itself. In some circumstances, we're actually exploring creating more of this habitat, like artificial hibernacula for some of our reptile species that live on grounds. And then off grounds, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, off grounds we're doing a little bit more with turtle conservation and even some general reptile and amphibian surveys. This is obviously drawing on my historic herpetological background, but it's falling under the umbrella of the Wild Toledo project. So what I'm hoping to do today, and let me explain, the main goals of Wild Toledo are obviously, like I mentioned, to increase some on-grounds biodiversity, but the key is to integrate a lot of our conservation efforts integrated better with education and our outreach and our development. We have a lot of donors and a lot of education classes that utilize the zoo, and it's very hard to take those groups to the Caribbean to talk about conservation efforts, but it's very easy to take them to one of our nearby lots that we've created or some of our research endeavors that we're doing locally. And on the bottom are some photos of that. I took one of our summer camps out to do some turtle trapping, and it gives us a great opportunity to give them a little bit more of an immersive experience into turtle conservation and things like that. And then obviously more local conservation is one of our main goals. So what I'm going to do now for the bulk of it is talk about Blandings turtles specifically, and I'm going to draw on some research that I did as a private herpetologist years ago, and some research that I did as an agent of the zoo also years ago and currently. The Blandings turtle, how many of you have seen a Blandings turtle locally? A few. This is by far the coolest local turtle in my opinion. I am obviously biased, but the Blandings turtle is a really cool turtle that honestly a lot of people don't get the opportunity to see. They're generally a mid-sized to larger sized turtle, for lack of a better description. They have a very high carapace. The carapace is their top shell. Kind of gets this appearance of almost a helmet look to it. But the key characteristic that makes them very conspicuous is this bright yellow chin. And they've got a very long neck, like most hidden neck turtles, the Clydridae, but they're able to really stick that out. And when they're sitting on a log in the spring, it makes them very obvious. It's a good field characteristic. They're omnivorous, although the majority of their diet is invertebrates. They're semi-aquatic, and what's key to their habitat, and the reason why they're not nearly as common as they used to be, is this habitat connectedness. A lot of our local turtles are happy living in a pond their whole life, but Blanding's turtles are not that. They spend quite a bit of time terrestrially, and they need a series of wetlands with varying hydrology. And so where we do see them maintaining locally is usually a situation like that, and I'll go into a couple of examples of that later. They usually overwinter in water like a lot of our local turtles do, but they're even a little bit more plastic in those requirements, and they can actually overwinter terrestrially in some circumstances. And they may actually even estivate during a lot of the hotter summer months. They actually have a cooler preferred body temperature than a lot of our local turtles. So when July and August come, if they're not in one of these larger wetland systems, and the wetlands get very warm, sometimes they'll crawl up on land and actually spend months sitting on the dry land. So there's our Blanding's turtle. It's kind of a charismatic turtle. It's characterized by having a hinge on its lower shell. It's plastron, and it's a single hinge. It's not like a box turtle that can entirely close itself up, but it can close its shell quite a bit utilizing that. So what makes them unique is they have a series of life history traits that kind of set them apart even from the other local turtles. The most obvious is they're extremely long-lived. They're the longest-lived freshwater turtle that's been documented, and that's 77 plus years. That's not even surprising. It's pretty certain that they easily go 100 years without too much exaggeration. So they're very long-lived. They have very late sexual maturity, even later than most of our other turtles, in the order of 14 to 20 years before they're even reaching sexual maturity. They have low fecundity generally. In a lot of the northern populations, they're reproducing biannually. That's one of their major conservation issues. They lay an average amount of eggs for most of our local turtles, but not nearly what some of our less imperiled turtles do, like snapping turtles have been known to lay up to upwards of almost 100 eggs. A little bit more modest numbers for the Blanding's turtle. And they normally have extremely low mortality among adults. This is kind of typical for a lot of turtle species, but when it's been documented for Blanding's turtles, it's even higher survivorship than what's been reported for a lot of the other freshwater turtles. One of the earlier researchers out of Michigan actually documented that most Blanding's turtle populations need 95% survivorship of the adult population for them to even maintain their numbers. Well, a lot of the current populations that we have in the state of Ohio are much, much smaller in their numbers, so any animal leaving that population can be catastrophic. But it's that adult survivorship that has really evolved with this low recruitment. In some healthy populations of Blanding's turtles that are stable, 84% nest mortality within the first 5 days of oviposition. Almost half of those occurred within the first 24 hours. This was that Cogden study. Cogden had a population of Blanding's turtles that went for many, many years, almost a decade, with zero recruitment. And they're able to do that because these adult turtles can live 100 years. So just to maintain their numbers, they don't require much recruitment. But that extreme longevity has co-evolved with a terrible normal recruitment into the adult population. So we kind of have a whole set of characteristics that really, put them on the edge of survivorship in a modern landscape. So any tweaking of those life history traits, either the extreme survivorship or even worse recruitment than what they've evolved for, can be, just the end of that population. So in 2010, Midwest Park hosted a meeting where it was exclusively about Blanding's turtles, and one of the products that came out of this was it was this conservation assessment of the Blanding's turtles, and that's what this map is taken out of. And even in 2010, when this was done, this is what it looked like. Since then, Ohio has elevated their state listing to threatened, but basically the Blanding's turtle is protected at some level within the state government in every portion of its range. And it is currently being considered a federal listing potentially. It's below what is considered a candidate species, but the federal government is really looking at it as a concern. And all the researchers in the states that are doing work are finding more and more a scenario of what I'm going to describe in the populations that we've looked at. So the populations that I've been involved in looking at over the last few years are these 5 that are marked on this map. And currently we're doing work at these 3. And the difficulty with an animal that lives 100 years or even 75 years means that we generally consider a long-term research project to be several years, but in this case, you would need to be undertaking even simple marker capture of a population for probably 50 years before you can reach any really great conclusions. So long-term population studies takes on a whole new level when you're talking about such a long-lived vertebrate as this. So these are locations that we're currently doing work, and what we do kind of varies on the locations, and I'm going to get into some of that and draw on a lot of the historic. This is the oak openings region in that green area. I just heard one of the plant groups is heading out there tomorrow. The oak openings is where we've done a lot of work with Blanding's turtles, and what's kind of interesting is when I first moved to Ohio, everybody thought of Blanding's turtles as predominantly one of the Lake Erie marsh species, which is where people usually see them when they're out birding at Ottawa or one of those locations. But I grew up in Michigan, and Blanding's turtles using habitat like this was not uncommon for me. The oak openings is a very unique habitat. We have two populations here, both on Toledo Metro Parks property that we've been looking at for years. But the oak openings is a historic depositing of sand from what used to be basically the precursor to the Great Black Swamp, the large prehistoric lake. So that sand creates a unique little linear habitat of unique habitat. Nature Conservancy called it one of the last best places on earth or something like that. It is truly unique habitat. It's dominated by an open canopy situation in a lot of ephemeral wetlands. Well, there's several unique populations of Blanding's turtles that we still find in this location, and how well they're connected in modern times is one of their large conservation struggles. You can see the kind of sandy soil and habitat type that's around there. When I moved to Toledo, it was one of these wetlands where you could just routinely see Blanding's turtles on a log. And it was the go-to spot for me to see Blanding's turtles. A lot of these wetlands. This is what that oak savanna habitat looks like today. This is an aerial photograph. The airport's in the center of it. Obviously, the take-home message from this is it's very diced up, developed. Some of it's agriculture. A lot of it is urban sprawl. This is one of the fastest growing regions west of Toledo because it's within easy driving distance of Toledo. So we're losing a lot of the oak savanna habitat in the oak openings, and these populations of turtles with everything else are becoming fragmented. But this is what you would see a lot of times when you would visit some of these wetlands. But the difficulty with that is you can't tell from a turtle population. You can't tell about a turtle population from seeing a turtle on a log. A lot of other vertebrates, this kind of presence-absence data, or obviously invertebrates, is very valuable because you can assume there's still a healthy population where you're at least finding these animals. In the case of a turtle that can live 100 years, you could be looking at a functionally extinct population for as long as 50 to 80 years. If there's no recruitment into that adult population, you're just looking at the same turtles all the time. And answering this question is a pretty easy one to do. Obviously, we just need to trap and start marking these turtles. And that's what we started doing a few years back. So this is one of those oak openings habitats, and you can see why the Blanding's turtle is remaining here. First, these wetland systems are luckily divided by a railroad bed. It's not a road. If that were a road, you're going to see later why that could be a much larger impact to their long-term viability. In this case, it's a railroad bed that's been turned into a bike path. But you've got the situation where you've got a lot of private holdings outside of a park, and you've got these real quality wetlands, and this wetland system is where the Blanding's turtle is still remaining, where it can move between these ponds and exploit different hydrology depending on what frogs may be reproducing, which they will often feed on, or invertebrates, and as these ponds dry up, they can shift around. Like I mentioned earlier, they're not the turtle that's happy just staying in a single pond. So what we did was some pretty typical methods, and the difficulty with turtles is you need to apply these methods for years. But we just ran some standard hoop traps, like up there on the right, and then when we would capture turtles, we would mark them. If you're running turtle traps and capturing turtles, we obviously chose to mark every turtle. That just seems like a resource to pass up on. But what we were really looking for were Blandings, and in the case of Blandings, rather than getting a marginal scale notch like the picture on the bottom right, the Blanding's turtle would actually get a microchip so that they would be permanently identified. This is a passive integrated transponder. You've probably seen them while you've been around here. A lot of those snakes up here are marked with pit tags. And that gives them a permanent identification. When we scan that, it gives a unique alphanumeric code, and we can keep track of who that individual is. But we still notch them so that we can visually assess who they are in the field. So over the years, we've kind of shifted around using zoo volunteer resources to run these traps, and we've marked these two oak openings locations, and we've caught quite a few turtles, and we've had quite a few recaptures. We are in the current phase of redoing both of these locations again, and it's really fun to catch turtles that were marked 8 years prior. or even 5 years prior and see that a lot of these even painted turtles have only grown, 4 millimeters since we last saw them. It's kind of really testament to how long they live and how slow they grow. But from these numbers, you can apply simple marker capture techniques. The problem is when you're dealing with such small sample size like those Blanding's turtles, in one population, only 9 individuals were marked and only 3 recaptures. It makes the confidence of your predictions to be a little bit difficult. But nonetheless, you can see that there's quite a bit of a difference in the population estimates for, in this example, the painted turtles, which are the chrysemes, and the Blanding's turtle, which is the Emidote. It's characteristic of the really small populations that these Blandings appear to be occurring in. And we're continuing to add to this data set and see if, unfortunately we don't find any additionally unmarked animals at this point. So all we're going to see is that those confidence intervals are going to become less than infinity in the one case. We do know that at least one of the populations, there was some evidence before we started working in 2006 of some recent recruitment. That's a smaller Blanding's turtle in that picture. Those animals are not showing up in our samples, and I'm going to use the oak openings, the top population that we've been sampling, as kind of my example of what you do see. So the other information you can get in the absence of decent marker capture recaptures to generate population estimates, the other thing we can look at is basically a size frequency distribution. So the bottom axis here, the x-axis, is the carapace length. And then obviously the number of individuals is the y-axis. These are the 3 species. The blue one are snapping turtles, the red bars are painted turtles, and the green bars are Blanding's turtles. So if there was recruitment, you would expect to see smaller animals. Now age and size are not all that well correlated with reptiles, but obviously hatchlings are much smaller than adults. So we see with the painted turtle, well, first of all, essentially all baby turtles start at about this size. So you can see for the painted turtles and the snapping turtles, we are finding smaller individuals, but there's this whole range of individuals that are absent in the size frequency distribution of Blanding's turtles. Well, this illustrates one of the big issues with turtle research. Look at the sample size of Blanding's turtles. Obviously, it's smaller than the other ones. We would like to continue to catch more of these, and if we can document this lack of small individuals for many more years, it's kind of, solidifying the conclusion that we're reaching from this simple graph. But that's why we would take a few years off from this population. Now we're revisiting it again this year to look for young and smaller individuals. But from this data set, you can see that the Blanding's turtle, there aren't any small ones there, which is kind of what a lot of these populations across the country are seeing. Small individuals, fragmented habitat, and no real obvious evidence of recruitment. So the other thing we can do from this marker capture data is, you catch a turtle at this size, at this date, it grows a little bit larger, and the date you caught it at, so you know how much it grew and how many days it took to grow in between that. So these are, repeated measures of the same individual, and we can apply them to a mathematical equation. In this case, we use the von Bertalanffy growth curve, and from that, we can get an idea of the average growth of these individuals in this larger population. We can use that to assign an estimated age to these individuals, which is what this graph is depicting. So the lower curve there is the growth rate of painted turtles with this population, and you're seeing that there's animals predicted to be anywhere from, almost 0, slightly above that, all the way up to 35 years old or so. Now, the actual age of these animals is probably not that, but it's the best prediction we have when you find when you just capture animals and repeatedly measure them. In the case of the Blandings, which is the curve on the top, you see a couple of things that are interesting. There's a bunch of individuals that are larger than what the von Bertalanffy growth curve even predicts as their largest size. So these are old animals. And by our estimate, that means that they're well beyond 60 years old. Now again, whether they're actually beyond 60 or not, who knows, but they are definitely old individuals. You also notice on the growth curve for Blanding's turtles, and this is including both of those locations within the oak openings, you notice that there's this whole stretch where we didn't catch any of them. There were none in that predicted age group between 0 and, was that like 35? So it's kind of, again, illustrating what that size frequency distribution was showing us. There doesn't appear to be any recent recruitment into either of these populations, especially the oak openings population. And in general, the idea is we're not seeing this. there may be eggs laid. We now know that they are laying eggs, so that's not the issue. You occasionally see painted turtles laying eggs in the early morning, but we certainly do not see young Blanding's turtle. This is a young hatchling painted turtle on the right. We've never been fortunate enough to see that with Blanding's turtles, despite spending the time and finding painteds that way. So this is what you usually see not only in the oak openings, but throughout a lot of this region now are dug-up turtle nests. These are not hatched turtles' nests. These are dug-up turtle nests by some form of mid-level predator. The biggest predator of turtle nests are raccoons locally. And in Cogden's study, when they went almost a decade without any survivorship, or without any hatchlings, that was exactly what was occurring. The raccoons were just eating them all. Well, raccoons have evolved to eat turtles. Turtles have evolved this extreme longevity to compensate for this high predation rate. The problem is, as everybody knows, raccoon populations are way up. Division of Wildlife has some statistics. I don't remember exactly what it is, but in the last 30 years, raccoon populations are up several 100%. If you're a species that's on the edge already of recruitment issues with a mesopredator like the raccoon, any bump up is going to push them to an unsustainable nature. So this has been a theme with a lot of turtle conservation, and that's caused Midwest Park to create this document. And although this document is reasonably simplistic, it is the first time that a organization, an entity, actually finally said something about raccoons and turtle conservation. It has been critical in a lot of new studies getting initiated, especially in freshwater, as far as managing these mesopredators and seeing if it has any impact on the turtles. So I kind of want you guys to remember raccoons like this. They're awful cute, and raccoons are amazing, adaptable mesopredators, but in some circumstances, especially with the way we're fragmenting turtle habitat, they certainly are probably a much greater issue than we ever realized. So since initiating a lot of these studies, a colleague came to me and asked if I wanted to be part of a project putting GPS units on the back of turtles. And of course, who doesn't want to do that? That's cool as can be, right? So we did this over several locations, and we continue to do this. We just released an animal at the Bumpus Pond site with one of these GPS units. So I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but this is what they look like when you're done with them. So this unit is a traditional radio transmitter, and this is really typical. This is what a lot of turtle researchers do. You glue a transmitter onto them, and these transmitters will last for a year or 2 years, and you have to go out with an antenna in the rain and the mosquitoes and track this animal and see where it is and what it's been doing. Your data is only as good as frequently as you get out there, which is one of the major issues. The expense of having to go to the location and track, 3 to 6 turtles, whatever the case may be, it becomes pretty laborious and just not really all that much fun. It sounds fun when you think about it to begin with, and then those mosquitoes they're just terrible. So what we started doing, and this is the antenna that this thing carries around with a traditional radio telemetry unit. But what we started doing was putting these units on them, and this is a GPS logging unit. Now this isn't as cool as what you guys see with sharks and things like that, where the GPS coordinates are uploaded to a satellite and then you can sit on your computer and see them. These are just logging the coordinates of where this turtle is. In the case of these units, we've moved on to some new technology for some other animals, but in the case of these units, they also have a user replaceable battery. So kind of by the time you're done with this turtle, you really got the bionic turtle there. Is that joke too old for this crowd? It's really like a $6 million turtle. So you let your turtle go with all of this kind of hardware on it. But the main limitation is this means you have to recover this turtle to get all the cool data off of it. So in order to do that, you get yourself a zoo volunteer, and you narrow it down to a corner of the pond, and you just make him dig around until he finds the turtle. And then you plug your turtle into your laptop. It's really just that cool. And you get all kinds of crazy, crazy data. So I just want to run through a few of these because I think they illustrate some of the issues that, Blanding's turtles are facing in our modern landscape. The first examples are going to be from an oak opening site. I don't know exactly where you guys are going in oak openings tomorrow, but this is the bike path that I showed in that earlier slide that's dividing these wetland systems. And these are a bunch of the animals' locations between, up in the upper left are the dates that are covered by these dots. So this animal spent most of its spring down in this location. It crossed over this bike path. And I'm going to repeatedly mention how many times it crossed the bike path, because in this case it's just bikes. But in any other landscape, this could have been a road, and every time that comes with a very real risk. So it moved over into these wetlands on, the north side of the bike path, was happy living in some of those little pools. What's really cool is when we start looking at some of its behaviors, I should point out these GPS units are completely programmable. So early on in the season, we had them taking points every half hour during the night because we wanted to know where they were going to lay their eggs, rather. And Blanding's turtles constantly lay their eggs in the evenings. That's just what they do. But what was cool is some of the daytime points show that this turtle actually crossed out of those wetlands, checked this spot out for quite a while because those are half-hour data points, and then went into this wetland in the evening. But what's really cool, went in that wetland during the day, but what's really cool is the next evening, the thing crawled out of the wetland and went back to the spot that it had checked out the day before and spent its entire evening at that location. The only time we ever got a nighttime fix was one night during a 2-month period, because they're not nocturnal species. They only come out to oviposit. But what was really cool is you start to even get a behavioral component to the spatial data, because we know that turtle checked out that location the day before, went into that pond, waited there, and then came back out that next evening to deposit its eggs. And this is the location where it chose to deposit its eggs. Hopefully you guys see some classic oak savanna habitat when you go there tomorrow, the plant group rather, because this is ubiquitous habitat in that location. So for these two turtles that we followed around the oak savanna, there was nothing really conservation-wise there. This was good habitat. They were choosing these habitats, and they're reasonably common in this location. Then the animal again crossed over the bike path and spent some of its summer down in those ponds, then crossed over the bike path again and estivated, there's no wetland here, it spent almost a month at this location just sitting in the dry area. This appears to be movements, but when they estimate, they go underground and the GPS signal was worse, so I'm assuming that's more or less error rate associated with the GPS unit itself. So it kind of estimated at that location. In October, it eventually crossed back over the bike path and spent its winter down in this pond. What was interesting, this was one of our worst years for rain in 2010, and this pond looked like this when it got there. And this kind of is a testament to the fact that they are able to hibernate terrestrially. It just hibernated in this location at the bottom of what should have been this pond, and eventually the spring rains, in this case fall rains, came and inundated with that pond, and then it completed its overwintering in an aquatic state. So what's interesting, and let's bear with me a little bit as I get caught on a tangent here, but if we assume, and this was one of those animals to be predicted to be over 60 years old, so if we assume she's 60 years old in 2010 when we did this, what's really interesting to put this in a conservation perspective, because a lot of times people don't think about behavior and the fact that these things are so long-lived. I mean, in some cases, they're probably longer lived than some of the researchers that are studying them. This turtle was crossing over this bike path back when it was still a passenger service, and that ended in 1959. That would have meant that that turtle was 8 years old at that point. This turtle knew, so to speak, not to be too anthropomorphic, when the freight service ended in 1969. It would have been 18 years old at that point. It knew when the Metro Parks made this a pedestrian gravel pedestrian trail in 1994, it would have been 43 years old at that point. And then it, of course, remembers when the Metro Parks paved that bike path, and now you're getting a lot more traffic in it in 1998 because it would have been 47 years old then. So what's really interesting is it kind of puts it into a perspective that we often don't think about for turtles and turtle conservation. And I'm going to get back to this point when I get to one of the Bumpus Pond animals locations. So in Maumee State Forest, these animals aren't quite as lucky. It's not a bike path that they have to cross. This is one animal, and during its active season when we were following around, it traveled for 6.8 miles total, and it crossed roads, actual roads, 5 times. Now let's remember the fact that they need 95% survivorship of their adult population just to maintain their numbers. It's awful lucky that it's able to cross a road 5 times during its lifetime. And we know that their behavior is pretty much the same year after year after year, so it's probably been doing that its entire life. Not shocking why habitat is so fragmented and there's fewer numbers of them than what there used to be. In this individual's case, it nested on the berm of a road, and this data actually comes from my colleague that was doing this work, Greg Lips. And it also used permanent wetlands in this situation, which were private ponds. These are the three animals that were followed around Maumee State Forest, and this was a little bit of a different situation for oviposition or egg laying. All three of these animals nested on private property. So earlier we had a Metro Park situation where all the turtles that we followed nested on Metro Park's property. That's what you would want for protecting that species. In this circumstance, this park location, despite whatever the park owners do, or the landowners, in this case the state, do to maintain their Blanding's turtle population, one of the key components of their life history is occurring on private property. You know, there's no way to necessarily impact that. And that's what we see at another one of the locations, the Bumpus Pond location that I mentioned. I'm illustrating two things with this. The fact that in both of those years when we followed this animal, it used basically the same kind of habitat. We only knew Blanding's turtles to be using this larger pond, which is referred to as Bumpus Pond, but they were using this ditch on the west side of it, which not only were they using it, it became a critical component of their habitat for overwintering. We had two turtles at this point that both went to this ditch for overwintering, and we decided in February that we wanted the data off these turtles. So we actually went out and we were digging around in one of these agricultural Lucas County ditches, which again, I wouldn't recommend that. That's not really a good way to go. They're kind of gross. At any rate, we're digging around there, pulling up these two GPS animals, and we find another turtle that we had marked from Bumpus Pond. And we've only marked 7 animals there. So a lot of the animals that we marked in that pond are overwintering in this ditch. And it's the same kind of scenario. No matter what those landowners are doing to maintain Blanding's turtle habitat or restore Blanding's turtle habitat, key components of their habitat are still occurring on private, or in this case, a ditch, which is run, by the municipality. And ditches in Lucas County are frequently dredged for mosquito control, sometimes at very inappropriate times for turtle overwintering. If you were to dredge that in the middle of winter, especially in this case, you would take out a large proportion of that population from our data. So it's kind of an interesting scenario that Blanding's turtles are currently dealing with, and we often don't really think of it because they're using a lot more wetlands than a lot of turtle species, and they're living so long. The other thing I found really interesting, I want to get back to that analogy that I made with the railroad. Well, a lot of people that I've spoken with and a lot of my colleagues have a difficult time explaining is why this Blanding's turtle population would leave this great little pond wetland situation where they could easily overwinter, and the paintids and the snappers overwinter, to go to this ditch for overwintering. And I believe, unsubstantiated, the simple answer is that pond was only put in the early 90s. So quite frankly, those Blanding's turtles probably never grew up, for lack of a better explanation, with that pond as a resource that they could utilize. They were going to that ditch long before that pond was ever created. So they utilized it as habitat, but it's not, part of their successful overwintering, because they show great site fidelity for both overwintering, which this animal went back to the same location, nearly the exact same location on that ditch 2 years in a row. They also show great site fidelity for their oviposition sites where they lay their eggs. So what are we currently doing? Well, we're continuing to do marker capture at these locations in an effort to validate what we believe is occurring, because the easiest way with such a small sample size to do that is to continue to do it and make sure that we're not seeing any evidence of recruitment. We're evaluating new nearby locations. In the case of Bumpus, that ditch communicates up to 2 other very quality protected habitats, Kitty Todd and Irwin Prairie. And both of those locations have an occasional Blanding's turtle show up at them. So, those may be a larger population altogether. We're continuing to do more of this GPS pod technology. The problem is it's extremely expensive. And the models that we were currently deploying after the last umpteen years, and we currently have one of them out there now, just are no longer serviced. So we're pursuing some funding to continue that, both at these locations. But the other location we started looking at, that other circle out there, is Cedar Point Wildlife Refuge. And we've done some marker capture out there already, and we've already noticed that in the case of a sample of 3 Blanding's turtles that have shown up this year, one of them was under 10 years old. It was very clear that it was not an adult animal. It was not sexually mature. It was between 10 and 20 probably. I shouldn't say under 10 years old, but it certainly was a younger animal. So although the sample is very limited there, it does appear there's some recent recruitment. but identifying critical habitat through utilizing this GPS technology is something that we want to pursue. We thought we were going to be doing that this year, and some funding fell through. We're starting to use some of these trail cams that we're using on grounds for some of our mammals on some log situations to identify individuals or total number of animals in a field of view, or to put them on new locations to see if there are Blanding's turtles utilizing those. And then one big question, which we are not currently undertaking, but a lot of researchers in Blanding's turtle, within range of the Blanding's turtle, are undertaking, is this mesopredator management. I can tell you in the literature, whenever raccoon management has been undertaken, it has almost always had a positive effect on the turtle population. And there are some local examples of researchers in Ohio who have done that and have seen an almost immediate response. So it kind of validates our hypothesis of what's going on as far as the raccoons. I do want to point out this GPS technology is really cool, and we are starting to do it actually on zoo grounds. I mentioned spatial ecology of our mesopredators. As part of Wild Toledo, we pursued a grant, and we're starting to put these radio collars. This is actually a GPS logging portion of the collar, and this is a radio telemetry collar. And we're putting them on possums and raccoons to see how they're utilizing the urban landscape. And kind of analogous to what I was able to show with Blanding's turtles, the ability to show school groups and groups coming through the zoo how these, larger wild mammals are utilizing an urban landscape to put it in more of a modern day context is extremely beneficial from the describing and discussing the value of urban wildlife. So we are using a lot of what we pioneered with turtle for some of the raccoon and possums to see how they're using our zoo grounds and nearby neighborhoods. So the answer to a lot of this, honestly, I think is just simple education. I mean, I think people undervalue education as far as changing people's values of wildlife and of conservation, but specifically in the case of reptiles, I think that the return you can get from your education investment on people's opinions about habitat and these species and the value of this habitat, it's really impressive. And I think it really does honestly come back to education. I know that's a little bit of a catch-all, but and habitat obviously plays a key role. But changing people's opinions, making sure that little Johnny isn't accidentally taking home one of the last 10 female Blanding's turtles is something that Johnny doesn't mean to do bad, but it could certainly have meant the extinction of that population of, a very small population of turtles already. So, or not swerving to squish one of those Blanding's turtles when it crosses, the road one of 5 times during its active season. So some brief acknowledgments. Greg was very critical on the GPS. And then we utilized a lot of zoo staff and volunteers. Some of the most critical ones are mentioned there. So that was all I had for you. I did that in about a half hour, didn't I? Excellent.
We have a question for Kent.
Yeah.
So you said that the turtle becomes reproductive active around 15 or 20, and the turtles can live up to 60 or 100 years old. When do they stop reproducing?
They don't.
They don't.
Yeah, and it's really cool. So there was a study that was done that reproductive senescence in such a long-lived vertebrate literally does not occur. But even cooler than that, there was a study done, I think it was Cogden, but don't quote me on that, where he actually found in his population that the most elderly females were more represented in the offspring. So not only do they not senesce, and he attributed that, I would assume rightly so, to behavior. The older females selected more appropriate oviposition sites. And so yeah, there is no reproductive senescence. Not, I guess you would, intuitively you would expect that, but I guess when you really think about how long these things live, there definitely would have to be some form of, at least not that can be determined in their lifespan. So the private land, and I usually get caught on this tangent, so I really appreciate you mentioning this subject. So where those occur, well, all 3 of those were agricultural fields. And there was, I don't think it was ever published, but there was a researcher out of the Cleveland area that had the same situation. The difficulty is agricultural fields, cornfields in this case, are perfect oviposition sites when turtles are nesting. they're terrible once the corn grows in. And not surprisingly, landing turtles did not evolve for corn. So they deposit their eggs in these agricultural fields. The corn grows up and it shades out the eggs, and the eggs are not going through their full incubation like they should be. In the case of this researcher that I referenced in the Cleveland area, he had 2 nests that he found in ag fields, was able to follow those. One never hatched, and one, when he dug it up, had extreme deformities related to it. They just, obviously you guys know, reptiles are ectothermic. The rate at which they're developing is obviously temperature dependent. The other component, which actually didn't even come up, is that landing turtles and most other turtles are what are referred to as temperature sex determinant. So any slight shift in the temperature beyond what they've evolved for could cause a skewed sex ratio. So in the case of the researcher in Cleveland, he saw extreme mortality related to the growth of the corn in these ag fields. But even if that were not occurring, you could easily get a shift towards one sex rather than multi-sex. No, they aren't. They aren't. And there has been some recent studies that some turtle researchers have created artificial sand ridges within the line of known paths that turtles were using. And there is some evidence from that you can create habitat along their path and they will choose to use it. In this circumstance, there were open spots in between. You may be able to create more open spots in the long term, but the difficulty is turtles show such great site fidelity that until that previous study, most researchers thought you couldn't even alter their behavior. Obviously, there is hope that you may be able to alter their behavior, but in these circumstances, even if you were to create a blowout, they probably won't immediately start using those. They're probably going to continue to show fidelity to the site that they had previously used. And whether it's an ag field that is not beneficial or whether it was not an ag field when they started using it, is ultimately the question.
Are these turtles being bred in captivity at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. At the Toledo Zoo?
We have had some reproduction of them. There have been some studies here in Ohio, too, where they have actually done head starting of them, which I'm assuming may be where your question is leading. In the Cleveland area, they had locations where there were historic populations. The populations were gone, and they went to the nearest neighbor population and collected some females and their offspring and utilized them as part of a head start program. In those studies, including that one and other ones where turtles have been head started, it generally is successful. The difficulty is you have these life history traits that have evolved for low recruitment. So it's not a situation where every member of that clutch of eggs would have survived, and now that's what we're artificially creating. So in a population of 10, head starting half of a clutch of eggs even is going to swamp that population with siblings of one another. Obviously, in the short term, it would probably benefit that population. In the long term, there could be genetic consequences that we're not really fully appreciating. And I guess it's easy for a researcher not to worry about those when it lives 100 years because, the next 2 generations are probably never going to see any of those consequences. But I think overrepresentation of siblings in a small population could potentially be an issue. So head starting does occur with turtles. These things can be reproduced in a captive situation. But I think as turtle conservation biologists, that needs to be thought of as a last-ditch effort.
Long-term, do you think the right hand for habitat improvement and connectivity is
Which is most important? Is that what you're asking? I think they go hand in hand. I mean, the short term, there's no question that if you could remove enough of these predators, they would probably allow for some recruitment, which would be, in my opinion, the first step because it would buy that population a little more time. But obviously, for the long term, unless that connectedness doesn't occur, a population of 10 is not necessarily the most viable. Although there was a recent study that showed some of these extremely long-lived vertebrates appear to persist without succumbing to reduction in genetic diversity like you would expect. So even a population of 10, as long as they're having some recruitment, can probably persist for quite a while. The other thing about predator management, when it's been undertaken, a lot of the more closer to annual species, birds, for example, usually they don't discuss predator management for those because you would need to sustain it. But in the case of a turtle that's evolved for high rates of predation, even if you mimicked a bad raccoon year once every 50 years, it could have benefit to that population. But that's just, those are other research groups that are doing that kind of work.
With a lot of sea turtle research, if the nests are being dug into, they'll cover it with like a mesh and bury their eggs in the sand. If they're nesting in like sandy areas, could you do the same thing with their nests?
You could, and one of the difficulties with some of the locations like the Oak-Oak-Means, the group that's going there tomorrow will probably see it. Their oviposition habitat is so ubiquitous, it's just so common that it would be really hard to isolate where they are. Sea turtles and some of the other more aquatic turtles will come up and use the same beach. So in those circumstances, people have effectively fenced off the whole beach. It just doesn't lend itself that well. Showing, the site pathology that you see with Blaney's turtles, it may be possible to isolate it, but again, now you're having a situation where you're arbitrarily selecting that one female to protect her nest rather than being able to protect the whole oviposition habitat. So.
Last question.
Yes, last question.
How do you deal with the owners of the private property who have whose property is very important to the turtles?
We currently haven't.
Yeah.
No. So the Maumee State Forest locations, that location was undertaken by Greg Lips. That was not me following that group. I know he did approach some of the landowners just for access to the property. The long and the short is the individuals we followed, we didn't bother to do. Where I have approached private landowners for access or other things, the reviews are sometimes mixed. Some people still in certain areas have a very standoffish view for biologists coming in and discussing it. It depends on, I think, a lot of who you are, and I think particularly the fact that we are the Toledo Zoo might make it a little bit easier for us to do that than maybe, say, unknown quantity of researcher. We have not recently had the need to do that, but I think that I think we would be received pretty well if we chose to do that. But if it's an ag field, trying to get them to alter their behaviors and not plant it as corn is going to be a very different sell as opposed to just getting access to their property to follow a turtle around. Usually when I do that, I get just funny looks and, heck yeah, you can. You got a turtle in my pond? So, that kind of thing.
You take volunteers out with you when you go into the field?
Yep, we do take volunteers. The Toledo Zoo has a huge volunteer base. We usually rely on those. We have interns that we utilize. Otis is in the audience. Otis has been the Wild Toledo intern this year and has done a tremendous amount of turtle trapping.
Dr. Krisick right now is teaching the teacher course right now in oceanography. A number of teachers involved up here throughout the summer. Opportunities for teachers to take classes along on these things.
That is actually something that the Toledo Zoo is currently developing more of, and this is an avenue that we're working into, especially with Wild Toledo. We want to be able to do a lot more of that, both offer classes to this avenue, but also offer classes at a teacher kind of train the trainer kind of scenario.
I think about the thing, just today while I've been here, I saw Dr. Krisick's class working with the remotely operated vehicle, and that was just pretty cool. And then I come out over here and I'm seeing guys plug turtles into the computer. You just left with science is really cool. I mean, it really is. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you guys.
Let's take about a 5-minute break till 8 o'clock, and then we'll start our guest lecture. Really excited about our second talk also. Obviously, I think Kent did a fantastic job with the first one on turtles and, different side. And I should also tell people here that Dr. Stanford teaches our herpetology course up here typically earlier in the summer. So some of you may want to think about coming back and participating in that course in the future.
And we go out with Kent, with one of our regular field trips, so.
There you go. Tagging turtles with glue and I do have to say that, maybe you guys ought to take a little bit of grouting training.
Yeah. Well, they don't sit still, that's the problem.
That was really very boogered up for you. Next talk tonight is really going to sort of shift gears a little bit, and often one of the things that we forget about in this business is we're working on the science, or we're working on the environment, or we're working on education. But you really have to figure out ways to, pay for this. Who cares about all this stuff? All the things that you're working on, everything that we're working on with Lake Erie when we do, later this summer we're going to do a day for coastal county commissioners, mayors, and decision makers, and a day for science writers, and a day for the state legislature and the congressional delegation. And it's incredibly effective. They love the science, but it really has a whole lot of meaning when they look out in the harbor and there's a whole lot of boats out there and they see there's a lot of money being spent up there. And there's a lot of jobs related to recreation in this state, more so on Lake Erie than probably any of the other Great Lakes. So we're going to talk about that tonight and a little bit about the trends in recreational boating in Ohio. And I think really we have the best person in the state to talk about that, probably the best person in the Great Lakes region. Ken Alvey, our speaker tonight, got his bachelor's in education at Ohio University. And I was really trying to bring Ken in at the end while we were having an education course, because a number of you are going to think about it sometime about becoming a teacher. But once you get your degree, being a classroom teacher is not maybe the only opportunity that you're going to have. You know, in the back we have Sarah Orlando. Sarah is our Sea Grant Extension agent, our Clean Marina coordinator, and there are Sea Grant Extension agents all around the country, many of them working with outreach and education in addition to a specific discipline. In the case of Sarah, she's really focused on marina development, boating, and doing it in an environmentally friendly fashion. But Tori Gabriel, who's not up here, is our fisheries person, focused on fisheries, but the non-classroom, well, even though they both will spend a lot of time in a classroom, they also spend a lot of time working with adults. Well, what Ken did is after he graduated, and by the way, Ken grew up in Parma, so he's, you know, Cleveland boy. It was right at the time that the Division of Watercraft, you know, here in Ohio was creating their boating education and law enforcement. This is a totally different concept to me. You know, you will learn this. Packing, as I say. You know. Boating education and law enforcement, brand new concept within watercraft. And Ken got right in at the very beginning of this. This is back in the 1970s. Continued on through the division, first working out in Geneva, this is in northeast Ohio, then moving into the Cleveland area, stayed with the Division of Watercraft for 33 years, worked his way up to being the chief of that division. So now he's covering watercraft issues throughout the entire state. He left the division after 33 years in October of '05, and in January of 2006, he started as the president of the Lake Erie Marine Trades Association. This is a really interesting group, 120 members. This is marinas, it's banks, it's the service industry, supply industry, relating to the marine industries. Trying to think all the other groups that are involved, boating dealerships, so all the boat sales, sellers, but he's also the executive director of the Boating Association of Ohio, which means all boating related issues in Ohio. With the Lake Erie Marine Trades Association, it's really about the top third of the state, but with the Boating Association of Ohio, it's the whole state. Everything related to boating in the state. So Ken's been the head of watercraft, avid boater himself, owns a boat out here on Lake Erie with the place over in Vermilion, but spends a lot of time over here. When you see the Cleveland Boat Show or the Columbus Sports Show, those are shows that are put on by Ken and the Lake Erie Marine Trades Association, along with the Cedar Point Boat Show, the Catawba Island Boat Show, Michigan City, Indiana, going over into Michigan and Indiana to put on boat shows over there. So, you know, very, very involved and understands, obviously, the fun side of it, the recreational side of it, understands that Ken's a very good environmental scientist, but he really understands the business side of it. And not just the tourism value, but the real business side. How many jobs are related to this? Because in many ways, the success of those industries Bekker about that tonight. Join me in welcoming Ken Alvey, the president of Lake Erie Marine Trade.
Thank you, and Jeff, thank you for giving my speech. Seriously, just a little bit about my background, and Jeff and I had a little discussion I probably should share with you. I did come from OU. My interest was in education. I had hoped to become a teacher, but things didn't work out, and I ended up applying for a job with the Department of Natural Resources. Totally unexpectedly, I ended up landing the job out of 400 candidates that they had interviewed to start a new program that dealt with recreational boating and education and law enforcement. And as a result, this was something the Coast Guard was trying to migrate out of doing the law enforcement and turn over a lot of the responsibilities because they did not cover the inland lakes. They only covered the navigable waters of the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, in our case, of the state of Ohio, turn it over to the states to take on the responsibility since they were already collecting the money that was coming in the way of boat registration and fees. So I started out in a fairly brand new program in 1972 after coming out of college, totally unexpected, not knowing what to do. We were trained by a variety of different agencies, including some classes from Ohio State, some from the Coast Guard, some from the Highway Patrol, and we went through this evolution of learning what it meant to be. When I came out, of course, I was 23, thought we were in Baywatch. You know, we were out there with no guns, hardly anything on board the boats, and we went out and rescued people, and that was it. Unfortunately, there were many things that came along with 1972, 73, there was a fuel crisis, 74, there was a threat to take away all boating, lawnmower cutting every other day for those that are old enough to remember that, and there were several other crises that occurred. But let me take you back even farther, a little bit about the history of boating, and share with you some of the thoughts and ideas that have happened, and then I'll get into some of the trends that are occurring right now and some of the challenges that are in front of us that are in the recreational boating community. Of course, probably the biggest event that happened on Lake Erie was the notable Battle of 1812, actually the Battle of 1813, which will happen here in a few weeks on Lake Erie to be recreated. Lake Erie was a part of commerce, certainly transportation, critical force regarding to who was going to win the battle of the upper Great Lakes and the mid Great Lakes, and of course that'll be celebrated here very shortly. Along after that came the idea that boating can also be a recreation, something that probably mostly the very rich had, but the subsistence fishermen were also interested in, so they could take out to a boat and go out and fish and participate in an outdoor recreation that also brought meat back to the table. But for the somewhat wealthier, back in 1885, there was an event hosted by what they had put together at that time called the Interlake Yachting Association. They're up here this week, starting today, with the Interlake Sailing Regatta, which brings in people from throughout the Great Lakes to come in here and race. But initially, those races were between the industrial magnates of the time. It eventually involved races. Some of them were actually one-on-one between Henry Ford and Edison and whoever else, a Hanna boat, all the huge industrialists of the time. Today, it's much more recreational. It's much more involved, not quite as heady with all the specific yacht clubs of the extreme rich or the very wealthy. And it also started involving some powerboat racing. Today, the event, like 124 years later, still going on. They're celebrating this week and next week with hundreds of boats coming here. The boating program in Ohio really started way back because what had happened is in recreation, everyone had their own little taxing zones. So if you owned a boat and you went to the Akron watershed, you had to pay a tax to go there. If you went to the Columbus watershed, you had to pay a boat tax to go there. If you went down to Dayton, you'd have to pay a tax. So there was some federal legislation that came along about 1955 that said the state should put the program under one umbrella group, so there wasn't this division of who's registering the boats, and each boat had 40 different numbers on it, depending upon how many areas that you went into. So there was a National Boating Act in 1958, which required some even more specific boating safety elements that went into the boating programs that allowed states to start drawing up rules and regulations on the boating safety. About 1955, a fund was started with the Waterway Safety Fund to create money to pay for some of the boating programs because boating was starting to become more and more common among the people, particularly after World War II. It seemed like a lot of people came back, particularly if they had served in the Navy, in some of the amphibious sections of the Army, they had served in the Coast Guard or the Merchant Marine. They wanted to get back on the water, and the best way for them, many of them, to do it was to get back into boating. But this program started to build some boating facilities to help that burgeoning group of people that were coming to Ohio or wanted to participate in Ohio. And then in 1958 or 9, along came a fuel surcharge that went into the fund to help pay for that. In 1962, they came along with titling because the banks started seeing an evolving of loans on boats, and because they couldn't credit anything back or attach it to the loans they were given on some of these boats, they needed something to attach it to. And then in 1971, there was a Model Safe Boating Act that was passed by Congress, and that's where that boating program where I started in 1972 started. And they transferred titling, registration, and boating law enforcement to the states. And of course, there was an evolution that occurred after that as we developed into what happened to be a very prosperous time in the late 70s. The 80s were spectacular. Economically, a lot of things were developed, but there were also some challenges that came up in recreational boating. And having served from an educational position to some of the law enforcement positions that were beginning to occur, many of the people evolved into a more reckless and careless just because of the sheer volume of people that were hitting the water. When we started, to give you some idea, a lot of times boating programs are measured on the number of people that died. And in 1973, my first year on the job, there were 72 boating deaths in the state of Ohio. Part of that had to do with the culture that occurred at the time. There's a movie called Deliverance, and some of the people around here may remember that, or you may have seen it. There was a massive flow of people that tried canoeing and running rivers, going over dams and through rocky embankments in treacherous water, trying to be a Burt Reynolds and have that kind of experience. Unfortunately, many of the people did not have the experience, the life jackets, or the safety education to be able to do that. Today, you're probably looking with a boating population of quadruple what it was in 1973, with only 11 or 12 boating fatalities a year. That's the success of the program. I don't think any number of fatalities was important at that time, but certainly it changed things. There are a couple other catastrophic events that occurred along the way, and that had to do with the recognition of alcohol and boating. For those that have been over to South Bass, there's a certain social atmosphere when you get over there, and a lot of the people that were boaters tended to imbibe in that somewhat reckless activity, but the scary part was when they got back on their boats. And as a result, there were many people that became injured or killed in different boating accidents. And so there was another evolution that occurred after that started cracking down on DUIs, particularly in boats. Earlier on, too, I should have mentioned, there was another one element that created an environment, too, was there were a lot of people who were dying because they, one, weren't wearing life jackets, and two, they were exposed to cold water. Today, the cold water issue still exists. You'll see it, and occasionally, in some of the accidents that have occurred, there was a ferry boat or a tour boat in an inland lake in New York a few years back where the boat capsized when the people went to one side of the boat. They rolled in the cold water, and several people failed to survive that accident because of the cold water. Since then, a lot of states have started applying a life jacket wear requirement for people from October 1st through May 1st to help support the issue of the hypothermia issues that were occurring with some of the fatalities. But I'm not here to talk about all that. I'm just giving you a little bit of the background of what's happened. The boating society continued to grow through the 90s, but it started to reach a peak because of the population and the demographic trends of what was happening within our society. And so I'm going to help walk you through a little bit of that. This just happens to be an economic impact statement of what boating means to Ohio. Now, a lot of people don't realize that there's a huge economic impact, a $3.46 billion impact that recreational boating brings to the state of Ohio. It creates a lot of jobs. It provides a lot of travel and tourism, and it impacts a lot of people throughout. Now, boating happens to be a passion for a lot of people. Not everybody's into the passion, but a lot of us that do feel it are passionate about participating in water activities. And I would suggest no matter what you do for your career, that you find something that you have a passion for, because that passion will drive you over the hard times and certainly bring you success during the really good times. In this case, you can see that there's been some demographic or statistical changes in the number of boats, but probably the biggest change is in the other boats that are here in the last category, because there's been an explosion of canoes, kayaks, paddle boards in the state of Ohio. And part of that has to do with some of the economy. Part of it has to do with a new generation being a more eco-tourism or eco-activity-minded people. Sailboats, which you would think would also be an environmentally friendly sport, has not seen the same increase that paddle boards, kayaks, and canoes have seen. And power boats, they have somewhat stagnated and about 15 years ago began dropping in numbers across the state of Ohio statistically. But that'll give you just a short idea of where we are here. And let's see if I can move some of these up. On here, there's certainly some things on the slide, and unfortunately I can't adjust it on the... Yeah. But just some of the challenges that have occurred recently, particularly in the boating community, and I receive a magazine called Boating Industry, and they point out many of the things that have occurred here. Needless to say, EPA rules on emissions and catalytic converters and fuel tank issues have been one. They've always been a challenge, and they continue to be a challenge of the concern about fuel being on the water and what impact that it has. The cost of oil has increased, as you can see, 213% since 2001, which has a great impact because most people that are into recreational boating don't own big boats. They own small boats. What you see here is somewhat of Disneyland of recreational boating in Ohio here at Put-in-Bay, because the majority of the boats fall in the 18 to 20 foot range. The average person may have an income of around $56,000 that may own a boat. And along with that, the other industries, the issues that find in our industry are some of the common things you find across in business, and that's healthcare as well. Now, what had happened is this was the production of recreational boats that have occurred probably in the past 60 years or 50 years. And you can see there was basically some real growth in the 70s and early 80s. And then there was another boom in the late 80s going into the early 90s, where production of a lot of the boats, the new boats that were being produced, was nearly 600,000. Well, along came the economic crisis in 2007 and 8, and the bottom began to fall out of boating. Needless to say, it was like the housing market. Recreational boating suffered many of the parallel issues that housing did. People left their boats, refused to pay for them. They were abandoned. Production began to falter and fall off, and to a point where it fell down to about 136,000 boats in 1 year, and that was about 2010. Last year, they were able to raise that number to 200,000 new boats made by manufacturers here in the United States. At one time, there were nearly 600,000. So you can see the boating industry, at least from manufacturing, the retail of powerboats, has dropped by 2/3 over that period of time, which also reflects back on what's happening with a lot of the people that are employed by the marine industry. Many of the stores, the marinas, and so forth have been able to survive this, but the ones that were caught with large product, particularly when the boats were $250,000, $500,000, even $1 million, were caught when the bank issues came up, when the economy almost defaulted, when people saw their 401ks drop to 40% of what they were at one time, people began to back away from an elective activity and preferred to concentrate their funds on what would find as necessary money for retirement. So boating became the luxury item that in many cases people dropped out of. And as a result, we saw a significant drop in that. Now, traditionally, used boats make up the majority of boats that are sold, or pre-owned boats. You can see that at one time, back in 2001, 28% of the new boats were new boats, and 72%. But as we've gone through the recession, that number climbed from 24 to 18 to 17% of the new boats being sold, but the increase of used boats began to turn over more and more, and it continues even to this day, where it's more like 14% of all the boats are new. The majority of the boats today that are for sale and transferred, which creates tax dollars for the state of Ohio, continue to increase in numbers. Total boats and recreational use. One of the things we began to see is that boating increased. There was a luxury tax that was applied in 94 and 95. There was a real drop in the use of boats because there was a luxury tax applied to it on a federal level, and it had a severe impact. Then they repealed it, and along came an initial rise back in recreational boating use, and it continued for a long time, even through 9/11, and then it took another pop in 04, figuring that our country was back on solid footing, and then 07, 08, the recession hit, and boating flattened out and began to fall backwards with total boats and recreational use. Now, these numbers are really difficult to come by because many states do registrations in 1, 2, 3, or 4-year registration, and we're looking at national statistics here. Ohio, because it was in a rust belt or a more sensitive economic area, particularly after the automotive industry took some big hits, saw a bigger deflection in a downturn in the recreational boating community. But this gives you some idea of what you may be looking at. Now, the U.S. population saw a steady increase over the years, as you can see on the one axis. The other one, it shows you where boating came through. There were different boating booms that occurred. Many of it was just from the recreational boating, and boating became more solidified when they went from wood to fiberglass, and then along came different aspects of recreational boating. The sailboard, the PWC boom was huge. It put people into a jet-powered boat that gave them a lot of mobility to do a lot of things for more of a risky activity, and people enjoy that. But since then, the boat registrations to the population has begun to curve back in the other direction. And it's a challenge for us in the boating community to figure out how to stem that tide to make more people enjoy boat ownership and certainly participate in it. Traditional ownership, again, has not kept up with the population. There's certainly a rise to it. And a lot of this will have to do a little bit later on with something we talk about in our trends and what we're beginning to see. Part of that has to do with the graying of the population of the United States and the people that most are associated or have been found in participating in the recreational boating community. The average boat age by year, the older or the more years we've added on here, at one time the recreational boat was probably turned over and put to sleep at around 15 years. By today's model, it's going to be closer to 20 years before it's retired. One, because the quality of the boats have improved, the engineering has improved, the training of people that are using the boats has improved, but the boat is getting older and older and older. And again, for the industry, it's certainly a challenge. For us, that we're seeing people who are holding on to their boats longer because of the economics of what's happened in our country. Now, the age distribution here, you can see from 1998 to 2000. We're seeing this group move basically the older group stays there. That bubble stays. The people that were in the 40 to 64 range remains moving farther ahead of the curve, and there is not so much of the repopulation of the boating people that are involved in recreational boating. And certainly it's something that we did some initial studies. Now here's how sailors compare to the boating population in general. Again, you can see that the bubble continues to move farther forward, and sailors are probably more affected than any other group of the recreational boating community. So many of the people have continued to own the sailboats and moved on in sailing, but they become more mature as they do, and the population curve continues to show the age generation move farther out on the curve, and there's less repopulation of the younger people involved. What's interesting here is there are so many programs that occur, and a few weeks back there was a junior sailing program that was here at Put-in-Bay. There's probably 20 or 25 clubs that produce junior sailing programs where they take young children, they put them out in sailboats, teach them to sail, and eventually to race, and then they come here and race for a weekend. And there was some estimation that someone wrote a book, and I can't remember who wrote the book. It asked the question, where did all the sailors go? Here they were training about 23 to 30,000 new children every year about sailboats and sailboat racing. But they found out when they reached 23, 24, they stepped away from the sailing. They stepped away from sailboats, and they have not come back. And so the real challenge for the sailing community, the Annapolis Sail Show, some of the other shows, is how do we keep people involved and interested in an activity that is both competitive as well as a cruising activity. It can be a real challenge. It's certainly self-fulfilling, self-sustaining, self-fulfilling activity that creates some unique opportunities, particularly when we have the Great Lakes like we do. I have several friends that solo sail that'll go up into the upper Great Lakes to the North Channel, or they'll head over to Lake Superior into Lake Michigan, and they find that exciting and exhilarating. But most of those people are in their 50s and 60s. They're not the younger people that you would find challenged by that. The same goes with the sailing crews that will be out here sailing during this week at the Put-in-Bay Regatta. The owners will be older. They try to recruit young people to get on the grinders, as they call them, or the winches, to crank down the sails. They're always looking for young muscle to help them out, but it's a challenge to find younger people that are willing to spend the time or to participate in the event. Again, here's reflects the highest level of participation since 2000. Now, the funny thing about recreational boating is, it's like they say, you know, best part of boating is having a friend that owns one. There's truth to that, because you don't have all the expenses, and when it comes to either breaking out the boat or putting it away and cleaning it up, usually you don't have many friends. But basically 1/3 of all the people in the state of Ohio have gone boating at one time during any 1 year, or at least have taken credit. And that's some of the surveys we've done with Ohio State and some other places. 1/3 of the population of the state of Ohio has taken to the water in one case or another. They may not own the boat, but they participated with someone on the boat. And it reflects this again, 33% of the population in this one survey had participated in recreational boating. The challenge is, how do you get the other people to participate? Now, not everybody is comfortable on the water. And I'm sure when you're taking some of the people out to do some tests on the water, you'll find several people do not feel that comfortable when they're over water. And that's going to be an inherent problem that you have in this. But past boating participants and people who do not boat total about 150 million adults in the U.S. And you can see about 32% are current participants, 31 are past participants, and 36, the bigger slice of the pie, are non-participants. The reasons they haven't voted vary in many different reasons, but about 50% of them are non-monetary. Many of them, they've either lost their boating partner, change in their work circumstances, no longer participate in related activities. They've sold their boat. Time constraints is always a big one. And because you have a boat, it does require you to spend some time to go from here to there, to sail in regattas or in races, to cruise somewhere. It's an experience that is like none other. You're basically, your water becomes your park, and you explore the water as you would a park. You see different places. You go to different venues. You cross the border into Canada and have an international experience. But a lot of people are challenged by that, and certainly that's one of the other things. The non-participants' consideration going recreational boating, many of them will say yes, some will say no. Many of them aren't sure they ever want to try boating for a lot of different reasons. And some of the reasons not to consider boating are some of the same ones you saw before. Didn't boat as a child, because the majority of the people we found that participate in recreational boating today did it when they were at their grandparents' foot, or they were behind the helm with their parents, or they had friends that owned a boat. And certainly they look at it today and look at the cost, the time, the activity, and in many cases the limitations that boating creates for them. So it is a challenge. Now, we continue to look at exposure as a child here. You can see who's boated before, who hasn't. The majority of the people today in boating, like I said earlier, are those that had parents. Many of them had family members that didn't. And the owner by ethnicity of any powerboat, this is the one element that's probably the biggest challenge for the recreational boating community. And it's the biggest challenge in the state of Ohio. Most of the people are white. And as I look around here, there aren't very many minorities even in this group. And one of the real challenges are for any recreational community, no matter what it is how do you become more inclusive of the people that may not represent just the white population. One of the real challenges that one of the speakers I had come in front of our organization a couple of years ago was a gentleman by the name of Dusty McCoy. He is the CEO of Brunswick Corporation that makes more recreational boats than anyone else. Brunswick Corporation on bowling alleys, recreational equipment, and so forth. And the demographics that they came up with is when they look at the white female or non-Hispanic female, the average age of that woman is 41 years old. When they look at the Hispanic woman, their average age was 19 years old. And his question to the audience, and the same one I'll throw out to you, is which one's going to have children in the future, and which one is the population you should be marketing your resources to. And for all of us, when we talk about the future of the United States and where the demographics of the United States are going to go, it's going to be the real challenge. Hence the reason they say around 2050 that the Hispanic population will, or the non-white population, will be a significant factor in everything we do. And if we don't start including those people early on, we're going to be challenged. When I go to a boat club or yacht club, and Sarah can confirm this, we look out, we see, for the most part, big, ugly, fat white guys like me in the club audience. And we're not seeing still that diversity that we need, that inclusiveness that has to happen for this activity to continue to evolve and improve. The key takeaways of what's happening recently, and I wish I had better news, but new boat sales are at historic lows. I can tell you because I manage 4 different shows, and many of them have a significant population of recreational boats. They don't make that many boats anymore, and when they do, there's no backlog of boats because they tend to be consumed by the audience as soon as they have. The idea of holding on to boats like they did prior to the stock market crash, the bank fiasco, which took out a lot of boat dealers, they learned that there's a whole new process in the economics of things. And when we look forward from what's happened in 2007 and 2008, in this long recession where in the past our recessions have been more like V's, they've come in, they've lasted a year and a half, and they pop back up. This one happens to be one that's gone down, It looks more like an L. It's beginning to shape more like a U, coming slowly out of it. It's been long and sustained, and it has a real impression on how people use and spend their money. What you can take away from this, I guess, point would be, when you look back at the Depression and what happened to the people after they came out of the Depression, their spending habits changed. They were more careful on how they managed and used their money, and they were very reluctant to take risks for that. And we're beginning to see that in the general population as well. You see it in the economic numbers that are coming out from the Treasury Department, or from the growth, or from gross national product. There's still a very cautious society out there, and certainly when you're in a discretionary income process like recreational boat, it's a challenge. Powerboat owners' average age continues to increase. The age of the boats are increasing. The primary boater demographic is shrinking as a percentage of the population, referring to the generally non-Hispanic or predominantly white population. There's a slow growth projection for the next 2 to 4 years, but participation is up and growing, particularly in the paddle sport areas that have seemed to have really found people an opportunity to get out in the water. And of course, when we look at it from our industry, we're looking at an ability to, if we could just somehow guerrilla involve 150 million more people to boating participation, we would have significant. You do it one at a time, but certainly it creates an appreciation. You know, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right, but we all work together, and Jeff knows this. We've always participated as a recreational boating. We've tried to network people together. And when you get people on the water, and I speak again for Clean Marinas and some of the other parties that involve or participate in the recreational boating community, they become stewards of the water. There's not a boater that I know that doesn't want to see clean water, doesn't want to see a clear and growing participation in the water. They want to see a healthy lake. And those are the people that come back, that reinvest in what's happening along the lake. Yes, there are some challenges, and there's always going to be conflicts between environmentalists and developers, and in some cases the boaters are caught in the middle. But we need to grow participation to make sure that we can welcome people to the lifestyle. Now, there's a lot of different people that have gotten together to try to come up with some answers. And they've developed what's called a Grow Boating campaign. And these are all the people that are invested in it. And these probably don't represent all the people, but they've tried to put together a program that encompasses more and more people. Because there are a lot of agencies, groups, and organizations that teach some type of recreational boating, respect for the water, respect for the environment, participation in sport fishing, and the aquatic life itself. And as a result, they've started to bring these organizations together under a single umbrella to work towards trying to turn around the idea that people may be removed from wanting to be on the water. The challenge, of course, remains there are so many other activities going on today in people's families' lives, in the family life of children and the activities they have, the internet, and people's desire to be on the computer. So we at the Lake Erie Marine Trades Association have that. The new program that is coming up, and that you can Google this website, is Welcome to the Water. It's an action-oriented invitation to get people to become involved in recreational boating. Whether they be sailors, like we'll be out here during this week, or you'll see in the different marinas and the yacht clubs, if you want to participate, you can get involved. Power boating, obviously, these are representative of the largest boats, but probably the biggest growing segment of the recreational boating community here and elsewhere is the small pontoon boat. It has become somewhat of a party platform for people to escape, to get away from shore, to be able to have a place where they can put people together and have a socialization that will help benefit and grow the strength of their family, friends, and community. And of course, there's a campaign to make boating and water fun and exciting, and that's one of the parts we're in. Now, there's an element that's even smaller than that. There's a subcommittee that I currently serve on, and it has to do with bringing youth back into the recreational boating community and trying to find out all the groups that have some type of touchstone with water, and we're working on that. But the Discover Boating campaign, which was designed and created by several of the manufacturers, tried to bring together the Grow Boating Institute, which would be Nike Inc., Discover Boating, which is the website that you would go to if you wanted to find anything about recreational boating. You'd go to Discover Boating and Google that site. And then Welcome to the Water, their logo, as you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, would be similar to the Just Do It you'd get from Nike. So they've created a national awareness campaign, and it's funded by dealers, manufacturers, engine, accessory, PWC people. Anyone that has engine horsepower promotes and puts into this fund. And of course, its mission is to promote and improve the boating experience. They're selling the ing and not the thing. The boating, the sailing, the fishing, the wakeboarding. It's important that we take our time to be participants. Current participants, you can see we're driving towards a campaign that get children involved, get parents involved. If you have the chance to put someone behind the wheel of a boat, they actually get excited about it. It's one of those things you find your passion is there if you get behind the wheel or not. But these are somewhat of the statistical breakdowns of current participants and non-participants and where their backgrounds have set them. Now, there's a campaign. They hope to eventually raise $150 billion of influence over a 10-year period with the hopes of reigniting the passion for the water and the boating. And this is what the Discover Boating page would look like if you were to scan down on it and to actively participate with it. It will give you all kinds of options and opportunities to seek information, what's happening in your area, and where you can go to find it. Here's the Facebook audience profile of what they're looking at. You can see the majority of the people between 25 and 54 are the Facebook users. When you get over 55, which is still a huge segment of the recreational boating population, and many of the people that are buying boats today are in that age group. One, because they want to take their grandchildren boating. They're seeing a real impact. Second of all, they're the ones with the largest discretionary income because they've found retirement and they're taking their money out of investments and putting it into some bucket list things they'd like to do. And we bring you back to the Welcome to Water Discover Boating program. And I've got a little video here that reflects on a person's experience. And if I may need a little help here to hit the video that's attached to this. Yeah, that's Discover Boating, the good run. It should be on the stick. I don't know if it's there or not.
Does it usually just play right away?
Usually it'll come up and it'll have an arrow. It's the stick.
Hey everyone, if I could just make a comment while we're waiting. How many of you have a smartphone? How many of you are on Facebook?
Yeah, sure.
While we're waiting, or after this, I encourage you to search on Facebook, search Discover Boating, and search Ohio Clean Marinas. You can like both of those pages, and there's a ton of other pages off of those pages that like other groups. If anything, it puts a smile on your face in the morning. They'll post fun pictures of dogs, families on the water, a fun little cartoon or something like that. So I encourage you when you get back, before you go to bed tonight, look those up, Discover Boating and Ohio Clean Marinas. I'm the Clean Marinas coordinator, and you can follow me around the different spots that I go across the state and hopefully maybe attend some of our events. Thanks.
as well as we can, if that's what we're gonna get.
All right.
That's what. Okay, that works. Got that up and running. Didn't know. Well, hopefully. Yep.
Appropriate whistle there. Sailing out. Great timing, Miller Ferry, thank you.
Questions for Ken?
I was fortunate enough to be able to take a sailing course on these vehicles, and get that training. But then was kind of disappointed to find that there weren't like any sunfish or other boats or so the two questions are first, comment on the need and availability or the role of non-youth education and things like that don't fit exposure of the child. And then also, in a weak economy, maybe what is the role, or is there a role of rental
Well, there are a couple of questions. There's about 4 questions in there. And I'll tell you, when I was with the Division of Watercraft, we taught a lot of boating education. We did canoeing classes in classrooms. We did sailing classes out on lakes. We took people and the high school kids to give them a chance to experience the water. It was part of the outdoor recreation program that we tried to do within the gym classes, particularly with teachers that had a passion for it. So you need some leadership to do it. The problem we always faced was liability insurance. Insurance drives so many of the decisions, whether it be a school system when you're taking somebody and putting them in a pool with a canoe, or you're taking them outside the school system. The second thing is, there has been a lack of rentals. In the old days, there were a lot of rentals, but because of casualties and injuries and so forth, and the liability that people have to put down several hundred to several $1,000s on their credit card to take a boat out, because many of them came back trashed, took a lot of people and really didn't make it a sustainable business. A suggestion for you would be to look at maybe Put-in Bay Yacht Club, and to see if you can join maybe as a junior member, or where they might have, No? Well, they do have classes, and there are opportunities. If you walk the docks, there'd be somebody looking for somebody that's looking for a boat crew this weekend. You may not enjoy them, but yeah, Sarah? The other thing is find a friend with a boat. But no, you're right. A lot of the clubs have decided that they needed to move forward, because as their population moved through the club, it's the same old people and the same old rules, and they need to reinvent themselves. They need to start with a clean blackboard and redesign what the club should look like. And quite often, it doesn't look like a lot of young people.
Yeah, I guess my point was that for someone that even had an interest, it's very hard to devote knowledge.
Yeah. Now, Sam is with the United States Power Squadron, and they've involved a lot of community groups, and there's a lot of recreation departments that do it. I mean, we've initiated, there's a program called Spirit of America, where we're taking people out, no cost to them, and I used to serve on the board. I'm not part of it anymore, I shouldn't say that. That does that, works with kids, and they have boats for programs. But I don't know anybody that just really leases sailboats or larger boats. There are some boat rentals, there's some timeshares. There's a Freedom Boat Club that's kind of like a timeshare. You invest in a boat per year, and then you can take the boats out. But you're interested specifically in a sunfish, or a small sailboat, or sailboard, or...
Something on the boat cut.
What?
It's been,
Yeah.
Thanks for your time.
No, and if we can help you, between Sarah and I, and somebody up here that might be able to... Sam?
I was just gonna say, a lot of what we're doing with people nowadays, they don't know anything about boating. They just want somebody to talk to about boating, learn about it, learn where to buy a boat, how to buy a boat, what to look for, those kinds of things. Power Squadron is a great place to join, and it's very inexpensive, even if you never place $50 a year. What you'll get a chance to do is get out on a lot of boats, because most of the members will take you out. So you're able to light, you get to look at things. We teach a lot of courses too. I mean, right up to, if you want to get past the license.
There's a Harbor North in Huron, Ohio, does something. They do a women's weekend on the boats. And the guy cooks for the women, takes them sailing. They all learn how to sail, and it books up. It's so popular among people that they join it. There's wet hen groups at Cleveland Yachting Club and Edgewater Yacht Club and Cleveland. I don't know of any out here. I'm more familiar with the Cleveland area, because that's where I did most of my life experience. But there are other opportunities, certainly. And just asking Rob, or go to the Discover Boating website, see what they have.
Ken, a number of the people in here have scholarships right now. And I know, tell them what Lake Erie Marine Trades Association does with your Lake Erie Day at the sport show, boat show, and at the Columbus Sport Show.
We promote shows, and the shows aren't necessarily, the shows are a way to collect dollars to advertise a collection of people to come see boats that help the boatiers. Basically, it's an advertising tool for them. But from the proceeds, we end up One, providing a day of our revenue at the boat show to Ohio State Sea Grant Stone Lab, for scholarship monies. Not that we raise a whole lot of money, but every dollar counts, and, we're very fortunate to have a good partner, and Kristen's been there several times. She stepped out. And different people have participated. Ed's been there, and Jeff's been there, and Sarah's been there, and they do programming as well. They have a opportunity to expose that. But the money that's collected from that day gets returned back to Ohio State Sea Grant, and hopefully funds maybe some of the scholarships that are here.
That definitely does. Yeah, and that's been hugely appreciated.
Yeah. And we also do some other scholarship fundraising for other people that apply to us. We do a couple fundraisers, some wine tasting at our Catawba Island Club. We did a golf outing and a fishing tournament a couple weeks ago with the Catawba Island Club, where we raised $10,000 or $12,000, and then we distributed back in scholarships. So if you're looking for an opportunity to, not large scholarships, $300,000, we give them away every year through our trade association to help people make their way through college.
Thanks very much, Ken. Next week, workshops on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Thursday. First one is aquatic algae or harmful algal identification. Right, it's an algae ID course. And the second one is dealing with toxins that the harmful forms of algae are producing. This is the last guest lecture of the summer, so the next time to visit over here or to come over is going to be our open house. We open it up on Saturday, September 7th. That's also the annual meeting of the Friends of Stone Lab. I encourage all the students and everybody here to get involved with the Friends of Stone Lab and help support us in that way. There's also an opportunity to come up October 4th and 5th and volunteer and help us put the island to sleep for the year. We're to de-water pipes essentially at the end of October, but there's a lot of cleaning and painting and really a lot of helpful things you can do for us. People in the intro courses, there are a number of different intro courses that you can take. And for the teachers that are in here, next year there'll be 2 special courses for teachers, one here on the island, week-long course, and another one likely on the Lake Guardian. The large 165-foot EPA vessel will come into the Great Lakes. And then, Matt, you want to tell them a little bit about the course for teachers on the Niagara?
Yeah, the Brig Niagara, the Commodore Perry's 1812 warship, we offer a traveling limnology workshop for all ages. Basically, you sail and experience the Great Lakes, Superior Huron, Lake Erie, learn about the ecology, and literally learn the ropes and sailing. Yeah. We'll provide the blisters for free.
And that would be a great way to get involved with sailing. And there's also, next year, think about coming back. There are a lot of really good employment opportunities for students taking courses up here. And also in the spring and Lillard, pretty good seasonal jobs starting in April and going through October for students. With that, I'm gonna let you go. I know you have a lot of work to get ready for tomorrow. Thanks very much for coming, and again, let's thank both of the speakers. Great job. On the way to the Jet Express. He's trying to catch the 9:30.